ॐ वासांसि जीर्णानि यथा विहाय नवानि गृह्णाति नरोपराणि तथा शरीराणि विहाय जीर्णान् अन्यानि संयाति नवानि देहि. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 22. As a person casts off worn-out clothes and puts on a new set of clothes, likewise, at the time of death, the soul casts off its worn-out body and puts on a new one. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Nice to see you. I'll be speaking today about my new little book. It's called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism. To give a little bit of background on how this book came about, and then we'll talk about it, some of its contents. I was asked a couple years ago to write a book for a book series. This is part of a book series. It's published by Cambridge University Press, and the book series is called Cambridge Elements in Global Philosophy of Religion. So it covers central topics in the different world religions relating to philosophical issues. So this is a book focusing on karma and rebirth in Hinduism. They have very strict guidelines about writing these books because it's part of a series. So one of the guidelines is it can only be a maximum of 30,000 words, not one word over 30,000. And the idea is to provide an introductory overview on a key topic that's accessible to a broad audience. So it's not just meant for scholars or academics. But at the same time, it's a bit of a tall task because at the same time, it should have an academic thrust and should satisfy scholars who are looking for references, who want to get a sense of the latest and most important debates, academic debates on issues relating to these topics. So I try to cover all these bases in a way, even though it's a short book. Another thing to keep in mind, just as a kind of disclaimer, I had no say over the cover design, for instance, which is pretty lame. And they really, because it's a small book, they should have published it as a smaller book, and then it would have been a little bit more substantial. And anyway, none of this was in my hands, so I apologize for that in advance.
What are some of the other topics in this collection?
Oh, I mean, there's like, it is a huge range. Like, they've got, they focus on like even obscure world religions. So like Afro-Brazilian religions. And so that's part of the point of this, is to actually showcase many different religious traditions and some of the key topics in these different religious traditions. So because part of the reason is that for many decades, Christianity has tended to dominate discussions of philosophy of religion. There's been an overwhelming emphasis on just Christianity. And so part of the point of this series, edited by a brilliant philosopher, now he's at the University of Oklahoma. He was in England before that, named Yujin Nagasawa. So he's the general editor of the whole series, and he's really big on diversifying the field, basically. So it's within the auspices of that effort to broaden that he asked me to write this book on Hinduism. Okay. Another thing about this book is that it's not just an introduction. If it was just an introduction, I probably wouldn't have written it because it would have been too boring for me. And so the publisher also said, we encourage you to take an argumentative stand, which I always enjoy. And so this book makes what I think is an important argument. The argument's been made before, but I don't think it's been made with as much rigor and taking into account all the contemporary scholarship as this book does. Okay, so let me explain what the argument is, but before I get to that. So who exactly is this book for? Because I said it has a broad audience. Well, I have in mind three different groups of people. The first is scholars and students, okay? because it gives an overview of the main academic debates and controversies regarding karma and rebirth. It goes into some of the nuances of these doctrines. Too often we kind of make generalizations about the Hindu doctrine of karma and rebirth, but that I argue in the book, especially in chapter 2 of the book, that that's just a mistake. That Hinduism is a vast religion in its own right with many sub-traditions, and there are many different views on karma and rebirth within it. And I'll give you a taste of that today in the talk. But if you want more details, you have to look at chapter 2 of this book. Okay, so the first target audience is scholars and students. But secondly, I hope that because it's not too technical, it's meant to be accessible to a broader audience. And so I hope that it's for any thoughtful devotees as well. Thoughtful Hindus or just people interested in these doctrines should also find benefit from reading the book. Also, people who are skeptical of the doctrines of karma and rebirth, people who just can't stomach them or on the fence about it, this book is for them too, because the main argument I'm making in the book is that it's reasonable to believe these doctrines of karma and rebirth. Chapter 3 of the book looks at some of the main arguments in support of the doctrines. Chapter 4 looks at some of the main arguments against the doctrines. And I look at both of them, I weigh them, and I argue that it's actually reasonable to accept the doctrines, which does not, so I'm not claiming that it's unreasonable to reject them. Okay, it really, a lot of it depends on your own background assumptions and a lot of different things. Like there are a lot of scientists who don't even believe in like a soul, for instance, an eternal soul. If you don't believe in an eternal soul, then it's hard to get off the ground with these kinds of doctrines of karma and rebirth, right? But the point is, if you come from a certain standpoint, if you're sympathetic to the idea that consciousness persists after death, then it's perfectly reasonable to believe in these doctrines. Okay, so this book is meant to convince skeptics of the truth of karma and rebirth, or at least that it's reasonable to accept these doctrines. And you might be wondering, well, what if I already believe in the doctrines? Then what's the point of reading the book? Well, even for those people, I think that it's important. First of all, because I think that even people who are sympathetic to the doctrines, who already believe in karma and rebirth, they may not have a sufficiently clear and nuanced understanding of what these doctrines actually are. Okay, so part of the point of the book is to give you a deeper understanding of what these doctrines are. So even if you're already Hindu and you believe in these doctrines, I want to clarify what these doctrines entail. And so in Christian theology, there's a practice called faith-seeking understanding, which means you already believe in something, but through reflection on it, in Vedanta, that's called manana. You strengthen your understanding of these doctrines, you gain a better understanding and a deeper conviction in the truth of these doctrines. Okay, so that would be the purpose of this book for people who are already sympathetic to the doctrines. So I hope that this book will give you a broad sense of these doctrines and some of the nuances of what they are. So in terms of a chapter overview, it has 5 chapters, okay? And the first chapter is called Karma and Rebirth in the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita. Okay, I started this talk with verse 22 from chapter 2 of the Gita for obvious reasons. We'll talk about it later. But what I do in this first chapter briefly is I look at some of the earliest Hindu scriptural references to karma and rebirth. Okay, and in the Upanishads, the 2 main Upanishads, the earliest Upanishads which refer to the doctrines are the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad. And then the Gita talks about it a lot. Okay, and chapter 2 is called Nuances of Karma and Rebirth in Classical and Modern Hindu Traditions. Okay, so first of all, what this chapter is combating is this tendency to view the Hindu doctrine of karma and rebirth in a monolithic way, which means there's just like one Hindu way to think about these doctrines. I think that's completely false. And I hope this chapter corrects that misunderstanding or that caricature of Hinduism. And I'll give you a taste of that in the course of the talk. But also notice that in my title, I say in classical and modern Hindu traditions. I'm also distinguishing historically between what I call classical Hinduism. If you want exact, start and end dates, you're not going to get them. But the point is, classical Hinduism includes texts like the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Manusmriti, which is another important Hindu text that talks a lot about karma and rebirth, and other kinds of texts from that period. Traditional commentators on these scriptures, like Shankara, that also falls under classical Hinduism. What do I mean by modern Hinduism? Again, that's a broad term and it's not meant to have very strict start and end points, but what's very clear is that colonial Hindu texts and figures. What do I mean by that? During the time of British colonial rule in India, okay, any Hindu writing or speaking about these doctrines at that time, who do I have in mind? People like Swami Vivekananda, the founder of the Ramakrishna order, Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramakrishna himself before them, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, Mahatma Gandhi, all these people are modern Hindu figures in the context of British colonialism. And why do I distinguish these historical periods? Well, look, in the classical period, Hindus had a kind of monopoly on these doctrines and they didn't need to really argue for them. They still had to in a way because they're debating with Buddhists, for instance, who are, of course, very active in India. And so they would have debates with Buddhists. But the thing is, Buddhists also believe in karma and rebirth. So Hindus and Buddhists would be not arguing about whether karma and rebirth are true, but about the nuances of the doctrine. Okay. And of course, there was at the same time a very ancient school, which everybody will appreciate because we all have a little bit of that philosophy in us. It's called the Charvaka school. Charvaka means we can paraphrase it as a kind of eat, drink, and be merry school for tomorrow we die. It's a kind of the school of hedonism. This is an ancient school. It's called Charvaka or Lokayata, and it's a radically materialistic position. It literally says the Vedas are the ravings of lunatics. The Vedas, they don't mince words. Okay, they say all this spirituality stuff is bogus, it's crap. And this is it. We only have these few years here, and then when we die, we're dead. Consciousness ceases, so let's live it up and maximize enjoyment as much as possible. That's what any sensible person would do. So that's Charvaka. So Hindu figures did have to, even in the classical period, did have to defend the doctrines of karma and rebirth against Charvaka materialists who just deny that we even have an eternal soul that survives the death of the physical body. Okay, but at the same time, when it comes to British colonial India, there are new challenges, new circumstances. Like what? Well, the British are primarily Christian. They're in India. They bring along a bunch of Christian missionaries. What's the main aim of these missionaries? To convert Hindus, the heathen Hindus, to accept Christianity, right? Which means what? The Christian missionaries are set out to attack these doctrines of karma and rebirth. And they said, this is all crazy. You guys are claiming all sorts of weird things like you might be reborn as a mosquito in your next birth. How stupid. Become Christian. So that kind of thing. So this is a very different historical context. And so these colonial Hindu figures like Vivekananda and so on. And another thing to keep in mind, scientific developments, right? Because one of the positive sides of British colonial rule is that they exposed India to the rest of the world. This is something that Swami Vivekananda also mentioned, that this is the silver lining in British colonial rule. Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in the middle of the 19th century, and that becomes all the rage throughout the world, including in India. And so modern Hindu figures have to update the doctrines and show how they can still make sense in the context of Darwinian evolution and modern scientific developments and so on and so forth. Okay, genetics, for instance. How are the doctrines of karma and rebirth compatible with the theory of heredity and genetics? Okay, so I talk about a lot of this in chapter 2 of the book. Chapter 3, as I said already, arguments in support of karma and rebirth. I talk about some of the main arguments. Chapter 4, arguments against karma and rebirth. And I look at both sides. And then, as I said, the main overarching argument of the book is that it's reasonable to accept the doctrines of karma and rebirth. And then there's a brief chapter 5 called The Relevance of Karma and Rebirth to Debates in Contemporary Philosophy. And I hope to give a little taste of that at the end of this talk if I have time. Okay, so let's get started. Here's how I want to proceed. I want to raise 6 important questions about these doctrines. 6 important questions. Many of you are probably already on board with these doctrines, and I bet some of these questions have occurred to some of you, but I bet you haven't thought of all of them. And even if you've thought of some of these questions, I bet you haven't necessarily come up with answers to these questions. So, but I'd love to hear from you in the Q&A as well. So, okay, we all know that at the core, at the heart of the karma doctrine is a simple principle. We reap what we sow, right? As he sang. It was a very appropriate song. Now, Sri Ramakrishna, what's the way that he put it? If you eat a chili, won't your tongue burn? Right? We reap what we sow. But here's the first question of the 6. According to the doctrine of karma, how exactly do we reap what we sow? Karma says we reap what we sow, but how exactly do we reap what we sow? This is the first question. And you might think this is obvious, but I don't think it's at all obvious. And if you look at the main Hindu texts and figures in discussing this issue, what you find is that there are 2 fundamentally different explanations of how we reap what we sow, according to the doctrine of karma. One I would call the metaphysical explanation, which was mentioned in the song, good, good, bad, bad. But actually the song, what you mentioned in the song, and this is also from Song of the Sannyasin, Swamiji's poem, I think it might even encompass both. So one explanation is the metaphysical explanation of how we reap what we sow. The other is the psychological explanation. Okay, so let me explain both of them briefly. What's the metaphysical explanation? I do something good. Because of that, some punya is generated, P-U-N-Y-A. You can translate punya as merit, okay? It's karmic merit. It's a metaphysical quantity. It's not something that you can see with your senses, but it exists metaphysically. As a result of that punya, what happens? I am born into favorable circumstances in my next life, or I experience something positive or favorable later in this life, okay? Sometime in the future, I reap what we sow. I get something positive or good as a result of my good action, as a result of that karmic merit, punya. And exactly the opposite is also true. I do something bad. What happens as a result? It generates, that bad action generates papa. And even though some people will translate papa as sin, I don't think that's the most accurate way to translate it. Demerit, karmic demerit, D-E-M-E-R-I-T. That would be, I think, a more technical way to translate it. Any bad action that we perform results in karmic demerit, papa, which results in unfavorable or negative circumstances, either later in this life or in a future birth. Okay? This in a nutshell is the metaphysical explanation. Okay? Many of you probably have thought about karma in these terms, right? I think that's the more popular of the two. But there's another way of explaining how we reap what we sow. It's what I would call the psychological explanation. This is what Swami Vivekananda, he accepts both. He accepts both the metaphysical explanation and the psychological. But he often emphasizes the psychological one. For instance, in Raja Yoga, he says things like this. He says, I perform a good action. That good action creates samskaras, which means latent mental impressions. They carve traces in the unconscious, in the mind, okay? And then what happens? At some point in the future, those samskaras will get reactivated. They'll get triggered by some external stimulus or something that pops up in the mind. And then what happens as a result? That samskara will make me more prone to engaging in the same kind of behavior in the future. So if I engage in a lot of good acts, it'll create a lot of good samskaras in my mind, which will eventually get activated or triggered, which will make me more prone to engaging in more good behavior. Until what happens? Until doing good becomes a habit. And then what Swami Vivekananda says is that character is nothing but a bundle of habits, either good or bad or both, a mixture of good and bad habits. Okay, which means what? We can reform our character by replacing bad habits with good habits. All right? So all of this falls under what I would call the psychological explanation of how we reap what we sow, the psychological explanation of how karma works. And it's important to keep in mind that the metaphysical explanation of how we reap what we sow and the psychological explanation are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand, and you can see them as complementary. And as I said, I think Swami Vivekananda, for instance, accepts both of them. But there are some Hindu traditions which emphasize one at the expense of the other. As far as I can tell, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, for instance, if you look carefully at the text, I think it's defending a psychological explanation of karma, and it doesn't accept a separate metaphysical explanation. Okay. And you might say that has certain advantages, because some people, especially people these days, they might say like, there's something kind of foofy or spooky about positing this karmic merit and demerit, papa, punya. How can we prove that that exists in the first place? This idea of samskaras is more palatable to many people who don't believe in anything transcendental or metaphysical. They'll say, yeah, even modern neuroscientists who are atheists, they can still accept that there are samskaras that acts, create, that they leave behind traces in the mind that makes us prone to engaging in the same kind of behavior in the future. And so you might ask yourselves, which of these two explanations do I find more plausible and why, or do I accept both as complementary? That's up to you guys. But I just want to, this is the first thing, is I bet many of you, it hadn't occurred to you that there are these two very different ways of explaining how we reap what we sow according to the doctrine of karma. Okay, so keep in mind that there are these two different ways, a metaphysical explanation and a psychological one. Second big question. Well, even if that's true, what I just explained about the doctrine of karma, we reap what we sow, I haven't yet explained how exactly do we get out of this cycle of rebirth. Isn't the goal of Hinduism liberation? It is, moksha, right? Mukti or moksha. But so far, I haven't explained how that's possible. Even if I engage in good actions, I'm still trapped. Because that just means I go to a temporary heaven, I exhaust my good karma, I come back to this earth in a new body, I do more good actions, I go to a temporary heaven again. How is this liberation? I'm not liberated. And if I do bad actions, it's even worse. So what does Hinduism say? How do we get out of this cycle of rebirth? How do we transcend karma? The key here is, it's not good enough to just engage in good actions. You have to inspect your motives, okay? So just take a concrete example. Let's say I go to a soup kitchen and I work at the soup kitchen, I serve the needy, but my motive is selfish. What might that motive be? Any number of motives. Let's say I'm a high school student, I want to get into a really prestigious college. So what's my motive? To add a really nice line to my CV so I can get into whatever, UCLA or blah, blah, blah. Selfish motive. Or I'm a celebrity and I work at the soup kitchen as a photo op. I bring my camera crew with me, and then look at how Tom Cruise is serving the poor. Wow, what a great guy. He's not just, he's still humble and he's so generous. Again, selfish motive, name and fame, desire for name and fame. Now, what if I engage in exactly the same good behavior, working in the soup kitchen? Literally, externally, it's exactly the same, but my motive is completely unselfish. If I do it in what's called a nishkama way, in an unselfish manner, which means I'm not in it for anything selfish, right? What happens as a result? The result of that action, that good action, is that I purify my mind. It's called chitta shuddhi in Sanskrit. And by purifying my mind, I become a better and better person, and I make spiritual progress. I come that much closer to the highest goal of liberation. I don't generate any new good or bad karma necessarily, okay? Now, you might ask, well, if that's true, one big incentive for doing good actions is kind of taken away from us, right? Because then we're not going to have favorable circumstances in the future by doing good actions. No, that's not necessarily true. And again, there's some diversity within Hinduism, but I'll give you an example. And I want to credit Sarvapriyanji here. He's the one who pointed me to this text. It's Vedanta Sara, a classical text of Advaita Vedanta. It's mentioned there that so when you engage in good actions in a nishkama spirit, unselfishly, the primary result is purification of mind, but there's also a secondary result. In Sanskrit, it's called avantara phalam. The secondary result is good circumstances in the future, okay? So within this framework, it's kind of two for the price of one. I do a good act unselfishly, I purify my mind, I make spiritual progress toward the highest goal of liberation, and I get the bonus of being born into favorable circumstances in my next life. So you get both, two for the price of one. So that gives us an extra incentive to engage in good actions, ethical actions, spiritual practices in an unselfish way, without any selfish motives, nishkama, in a nishkama way, okay? Okay, so that's the second major question. How exactly do we escape from this karmic cycle? The key is inspect your motives and make sure that your motive is always unselfish. Third big question, I bet this has occurred to at least some of you, but I'm actually curious, so I want to ask you this. I want to know your answer very quickly. Let's not turn it into like a free-for-all, but just let's see what your answers are. Who or what reincarnates? This is a fundamental question. If we believe in rebirth, well, who or what exactly reincarnates? What do you think? Just throw out an answer. Okay, the subtle body is one suggestion. Sukshma Sharira means the subtle body. Anyone else? No? Hasn't this question occurred to you? Who or what is reborn? Okay, so anyway, huh? Okay, along with the soul. Good. So now she's modified her, nuanced her answer. So at first the answer was subtle body, and then she says, well, along with the soul, the subtle body along with the soul. So good. Okay, very good. Within Hinduism, what we'll find is that there's a range of answers to this question, depending on which tradition we're thinking of. So I'll give you a couple examples. The Sankhya answer to the question, okay, which is one of the oldest schools of Hindu philosophy. The Sankhya answer is her first answer, which is just the subtle body. It's the subtle body that reincarnates, that takes up new bodies from birth to birth. Okay. Now, there's a certain problem with that answer. There are multiple problems, but one of the big problems is this. According to Sankhya, and according to all schools of Hindu philosophy, the subtle body itself is insentient. It's not conscious. It falls on the side of what's called prakriti, insentient nature. Okay. Now, what sense does it make to say that something as insentient as a stone or as this, lectern reincarnates from birth to birth? What sense does that make? Why would a rock reincarnate? A rock can't feel suffering, so the subtle body by itself also can't feel suffering. It can't feel bondage. It can't desire liberation, because all of those are conscious experiences, which insentient entities lack. So that's a big problem, and I talk about that in chapter 2 of this book. If you want to look at that section, there's a section on Sankhya, and the problem with the Sankhyan answer to the question of who or what reincarnates. The Sankhyan answer is just the subtle body. Okay, on the other hand, there's another tradition within Hinduism called Nyaya. This is the logical school of Indian philosophy. And their answer is exactly the opposite, in a way, of the Sankhya answer. The answer is, it's just the Atman, just the conscious soul or the conscious self, which reincarnates. Okay, and they don't posit a separate subtle body, interestingly. And then there's a third answer, which is what Gita finally comes to. She says, it's a subtle body in association with the Jivatma, the individual soul. So this is the Vedantic answer. All schools of Vedanta give this answer to the question, who or what reincarnates. The answer is, it's the conscious self or the conscious soul, which is called the Jivatma, the Jiva or the Jivatma, in association with the subtle body. In association with the subtle body. And what is the subtle body? Basically, it's just the mind, okay, which is the repository of all our samskaras, which I already explained, the latent mental impressions left by our past actions, okay? Now, Bhagavad Gita, for instance, chapter 15, verse 8, explains very precisely what happens at the time of death. The moment the body dies, what happens? The Jivatma leaves the physical body along with, but takes along with it, the subtle body, just as the wind steals the fragrance of the perfume from a vase which is full of flowers, using this very beautiful metaphor. Okay, so the jiva takes from the physical body, the gross physical body, the subtle body, like the wind steals the fragrance from a vase of flowers. Okay, so this is the Vedantic answer. When I said this in a previous talk, there's a classical Advaitin who freaked out and said, wait a minute, Advaita Vedanta doesn't support this because we don't even believe in rebirth and all this stuff. Yeah. Only from the ultimate standpoint. So we always have to bring in, from the standpoint of classical Advaita, there are always these two standpoints. There's the empirical standpoint, Vyavaharika, and there's Paramatika. From the Paramatika standpoint, from the ultimate standpoint, there's no rebirth. There can't be birth. If there's no birth, there's no rebirth. There's only the non-dual self, non-dual pure consciousness, which is never born. And so there's no rebirth. And all of this is a dream. When you attain the highest knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness, you realize none of this ever happened. That's true from the ultimate standpoint. But from the empirical standpoint, Shankara accepts absolutely everything. Karma. Look at his commentary on this verse, on 15.8 of Bhagavad Gita, and you'll find that. He accepts the Jivatma, he accepts the subtle body, he accepts that at the time of death, the Jivatma, in association with the subtle body, leaves the grossly physical body and then takes on a new one, and so on. So all of it's true from the empirical standpoint. So that's why I'm saying that all the schools of Vedanta accept this answer to the question, who or what reincarnates? The answer is the Jivatma, the conscious soul, the conscious individual self, in association with the insentient subtle body, which is the repository of our latent mental impressions. Okay? Okay. So I've covered 3 questions. 4th question, another really important one. What exactly is the overarching purpose of the law of karma? We reap what we sow, but what's the point? What's the main point? And what I find in Hindu traditions is that you get 2 very different answers to this question. And again, it partly has to do with this historical trajectory of Hinduism. And I find that classical Hindu figures and texts emphasize one answer to the question, and modern Hindu figures, some of them at least, tend to emphasize another kind. So what are these 2 different ways of thinking about the overarching purpose of karma? One is what I call the retributive explanation, and the second is the evolutionary explanation. Okay? So the retributive explanation is this: the overarching purpose of karma is to reward or punish us. Retribution. I do something good, God rewards me with a lollipop. I do something bad, God gives me a slap on the wrist, or something much worse. Okay? I'm rewarded or I'm punished. And that's the basic punishment. That's the basic purpose of the law of karma. It's like this elaborate cosmic justice system where God is the judge and gives us what we deserve. Okay, that's the retributive explanation, and you find it in a lot of texts, classical texts especially, classical Hindu texts. But there's a totally different way of thinking about the overarching purpose, which still accepts the fundamental principle of karma, which is that we reap what we sow. But what these modern Hindu figures say, who do I have in mind? Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, and so on. All of these modern Hindu figures say the overarching purpose of the doctrine of karma is not to reward or punish us, but to foster our moral and spiritual evolution. Okay, so yes, if I eat a chili, my tongue will burn. Is the ultimate purpose just to make me feel pain? No. Or to punish me? No. What happens when my tongue burns? I tell myself, whoa, I better not eat a chili in the future. Some people like chili, it's fine, let them eat it again until they get stomach problems. But the point is, if once my tongue burns, I know in the future to avoid that action. And what happens as a result? I learn and I grow and I evolve. This is a story of spiritual life, right? It's because of this doctrine of karma that we grow and we evolve and we learn and we become better people and we become more spiritual over time. This is what's called the evolutionary doctrine of karma. This is the doctrine, this is the approach to karma that Sri Ramakrishna and these other great modern Hindu figures defended. Okay, and I think from a spiritual standpoint, it's more helpful to think about the doctrine of karma from the standpoint of evolution rather than in terms of reward and punishment. Otherwise, it becomes this kind of doctrine of fear, like I should do good things out of fear of punishment, and that's not the best motive. That becomes selfish at a higher degree. Okay, 5th big question. And this is a whole can of worms, which I'm only going to briefly open and then shut back up again. Is karma compatible with free will? The song that we started with is about how we alone are to blame, right? What are the exact words? No one but me to blame. And this is something that Swami Vivekananda also emphasizes a lot in his lectures and Sangha the Sannyasin. But interestingly, I don't know how many of you know this, but it's the same Swami Vivekananda who, in a number of lectures, says we have no free will. Absolutely none. He follows his guru, Sri Ramakrishna, in saying we have absolutely no free will. And he says that the law of karma is absolutely deterministic. And if you have any doubts about this, I have an article coming out in a few months. It's coming out in a book honoring the work of Arindam Chakraborty. a famous philosopher of a scholar of Indian philosophy. The book is called Thinking Without Borders, Essays in Honor of Arindam Chakraborty, and so I have a chapter there. The chapter is elaborating Swami Vivekananda's views on karma and arguing that Swami Vivekananda held what I call karmic determinism, which means that the law of karma determines absolutely everything we do, think, and say. Even a thought, if it comes up in our minds, even that's determined by something that we did in the past, okay? Which means there's no room for free will. And then the obvious question is, well, then isn't Swamiji contradicting himself? On the one hand, he says we alone are responsible for what happens to us and our actions. And yet, at the same time, we have no free will. How is that possible? To understand that, we need to go back to the teachings of his master, Sri Ramakrishna. Because Sri Ramakrishna says we have no free will, God alone is a doer. And yet, so long as we have not realized God, we cannot help but feel that we're free and therefore morally responsible for our actions. Okay, and so that's also important in Swamiji's position, Swami Vivekananda's position. Even though at the end of the day, God alone is a doer, until we've realized God, our conscience will prick us anytime we do something bad. And we're not gonna be able to sleep at night, especially if it's something really bad, right? Which means what? We still feel morally responsible for our actions. We're gonna feel morally responsible for our actions until we realize God. And why is this the case? Because God herself, in her infinite wisdom, knew that knowing that we don't have any free will is not going to be very helpful for most people, right? So the way that Sri Ramakrishna put it is, if we didn't know that, if we knew that we weren't free, then we would commit much more sin than we already do. We already commit enough sin, but we would do a lot more bad things as a result. So that's why God, in her infinite wisdom, has implanted in us the illusion of free will, which is the basis for feeling that we're morally responsible for our actions, that we alone are to blame, okay? Even though when we realize God, we realize, oh, it was just God all along. God was using us as puppets, but we don't know that. And so long as we, even if we can intellectually fathom that, we can understand that, it doesn't sink in deep. You know, there's a professor at Stanford named Robert Sapolsky who wrote a fat book called Determined, defending determinism, total determinism. We have not one iota of free will. And at the same time, in the same book, he says, but you know what? No matter how much I say that, even though I believe that we have no free will for decades, the moment I get off the chair, or the moment I stop, I still feel that I'm free. So there's this kind of, there's a phenomenological contradiction, or a kind of like experiential contradiction between my intellectual conviction that I have no free will and yet my lived experience. My lived experience is that I'm free. Sri Ramakrishna understood that. And what Sri Ramakrishna said is, yeah, that's because God planned things that way. Until we've realized God, we cannot help but feel that we're free and therefore morally responsible for our actions. Okay, so as I said, can of worms now shut. Okay. But I want to add, before I just completely shut it, one more point. There's an even higher standpoint than that God alone is a doer. The highest standpoint is a standpoint of vijnana. Okay, and so it seems to me that Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, a little bit less clearly, but Sri Ramakrishna very clearly, he distinguishes three main standpoints. The agyani, number one, the agyani, number two, the jivan mukta, and number three, the vijnani. So what are these three? I'll just explain them briefly. The agyani is the one who has not yet realized God, the ignorant person, most of us. Okay, that person feels I'm free and morally responsible for my actions. Second standpoint, the jivan mukta. If you look carefully at the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna defines the jivan mukta, the one who is liberated while still in the physical body, as the person who knows that God alone is a doer. This is the jivan mukta. He defines the jivan mukta from the standpoint of bhakti. This is important, okay? God alone is a doer. But there's an even greater standpoint. He calls it the standpoint of vijnana. The vijnani realizes not just that God alone is a doer, but that God alone has become the 24 cosmic principles. There's nothing but God, which means what? Ultimately, we do have free will, but as God, not as this body-mind complex, not as ego, not even as jiva, but as God. The more we can align ourselves with or identify with divine consciousness, the more free will we have. And if we perfectly identify with divine consciousness, we inherit God's free will. So if anyone who is familiar with Tantra or Kashmiri Shaivism, you'll sense the resonances here. It's the same kind of idea. If you identify with Shiva, you're as free as Shiva is, right? And Shiva then is playfully manifesting as all the different jivas, right? Okay, final question. So I've covered 5 questions. This is one of these questions that often comes up, even among non-Hindus who hear about karma and rebirth. The question is it possible, like we're human beings in this birth, but is it possible that in our next birth, we're going to be born as an insect, as a plant, as a microbe? Is that possible? This is something that comes up even in pop culture, in the Big Bang Theory. Rajesh Kutrapalli, the Indian character, the actor Kunal Nair, he used to come to our center a couple of years ago when I first joined there, when I first came there. He and his wife would come. So his character, Rajesh Kutrapalli, tells Leonard, another one of the main characters, who has a crush on Penny. And he's this like nerdy physicist, and so he's kind of cowardly. And so instead of telling her his feelings, he keeps to himself. And so she's dating somebody else. And Leonard passive aggressively tries to sabotage her date with this other guy because he's jealous, because he's in love with her. And Rajesh tells him, and then Leonard admits, I feel bad about doing this, about sabotaging Penny's date. And then Rajesh says, of course you feel bad. It's because you're messing up your karma. You're screwing up your karma, dude. And in your next life, because of what you've done, you're going to be reborn as a banana slug. So this is a common question that comes up. Is it possible that if we do really bad things, we'll be reborn as a banana slug? Okay, now, so I talk about this briefly in this book as well. What's fascinating is within our tradition, there are different answers to this question. Swami Vivekananda, when he was asked this question point blank, and his answer was very direct. Yes, it is possible. He isn't going to banana slugs and all that. But what he says is, if you as a human being behave like a beast, if you behave like a lower animal, you might very well be reborn as a lower animal in your next birth, okay? It's very rational. Now, another direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna gives exactly the opposite answer. Can you guess who? Anyone? Well, you might already know, but anyone? Abhedananda, Swami Abhedananda ji. He's written multiple books on karma and rebirth. And there, he says, no, it's not possible. Once you're a human being, you can't regress to a non-human birth, either as a non-human animal or as a plant, okay? So that's interesting, that even within our own tradition, there's diversity in answering this question. Can we regress from a human to a non-human birth? Let alone within the broader tradition of Hinduism, okay? So take your pick, whatever position appeals to you the most. Okay, now, since we don't have, oh my goodness, I mean, it's already, we're almost, so we have about 10 minutes, I think. So this gives us more reason to buy the book, and then you can read all the stuff that I won't be able to talk about in the book. So let me briefly summarize some of the main arguments in support of karma and rebirth. That's what I discuss in chapter 3 of the book. One example, the argument from innate aptitudes and dispositions. This is a classical Hindu argument, which you find especially in the Nyaya tradition, but you'll find Swami Vivekananda also defending the same kind of argument. What's the argument here? It's pretty simple. Imagine that a duckling has just been born, and there's a body of water right next to it. What happens? Within hours, the duckling will bloop, bloop, bloop. It'll jump in the water and start swimming. How miraculous, amazing. How is that possible? How is it possible for a duckling who didn't go through, swimming lessons, or mommy duck didn't teach it yet how to swim? How is it possible that it swims? Right? And so the Hindu argument is, it's because it learned in a previous birth. And those actions of swimming or left behind samskaras, traces in the mind, so that when it came not as a blank slate, but with those swimming samskaras built into it when it was born. And so that baby duckling immediately was able to swim. Okay. There's a more modern version of this argument, which is what we can call the argument from child prodigies, which would be like, think about Mozart, for instance. From the age of 4 or 5, he was able to compose piano pieces. Incredible. Pascal, from a very young age, he was exhibiting scientific genius. How is that possible? And the argument goes, Mozart was already an accomplished musician in his past life. He had those samskaras, so then even as a kid, those samskaras kicked in and he was able to compose those pieces. And the same thing goes for Pascal or any other child genius. Okay. Now, of course, there's a very obvious modern objection. What's the objection? Well, you can explain the duckling's ability to swim as something that's just an innate genetic trait, right? Something that it inherited from its ancestors. Swamiji has a sophisticated answer to this, because even though genetics hadn't yet come up, heredity was still a big thing because of Darwin and all that. He took that into account. He wrote an essay on reincarnation where he responded to this heredity objection. And he says a few things, but the main thing he says, like, look, even if we accept heredity, which Hindus do, he says, the doctrines of karma and rebirth are perfectly compatible with heredity. And he says, in fact, when the soul is ready to choose the next body that it's going to inhabit in its next birth, it'll take into account the genetic makeup of that body, right? It'll look at what is the genetic makeup, the hereditary makeup of the new body that I'm going to inhabit. And if it doesn't fit the bill, then it's going to look at another body. So genetics is perfectly compatible with karma and rebirth. And there's a lot more to it, but you'll have to look at the book. Because we don't have time, I'll mention very briefly one or two more arguments in favor of karma and rebirth. Then we'll go on to some of the main arguments against. And then finally talk briefly about why is all this relevant to us as spiritual essence. Okay, so another argument, the argument from verified reports of past life memories. This is a hot argument right now. It's trending, as it were. Jim Tucker is a major researcher doing important work in this field. He's a professor at the University of Virginia. He's published a book called Before, Children's Memories of Past Lives, which actually is a compilation of 2 books where he gives remarkable cases of young kids who have these extraordinarily vivid memories of past lives, and their parents or other people verify those memories. Okay, and I don't have time to go into examples, but look at that book called Before by Jim Tucker if you want examples. So this is another important source of evidence. And there's another book called Many Lives, Many Masters, where a woman was put under by a professional psychotherapist named Brian Weiss, a young woman. And she just started recalling memories of many past lifetimes. And he verified them in an indirect way, not directly, but indirectly, because she would sometimes adopt a different tone of voice. Instead of her, womanly 20-something American voice, it became very hoarse and almost masculine. And it became frightening. Like we just had Halloween yesterday, but it was sounded kind of scary when she started speaking in that weird other voice. And then he asked, like, who are you? And she no longer identified as that woman. She said, I'm a master. And then she explained that I'm this master, a kind of something like a guardian angel, somebody who takes care of us from birth to birth and kind of looks over us. And that as a master, she told him things about his own personal life, which that woman could not possibly have known. Like that he has a picture in his house, which she had never visited, with these details and this and that. So that's what I mean by indirect verification of past life memories. Okay, so there's a lot more to that, but you have to look at chapter 3 of my book. Okay, but I want to skip to some of the main arguments against karma and rebirth, and how Hindus who believe in these doctrines might respond to these objections. So the first obvious objection is what's called the lack of memory objection. Well, if we had past lives, why don't we remember them? Simple objection, right? Now, one answer is that, well, some people do, as we know, those young kids, but those are very rare. Those cases are very rare. Why don't most of us? The answer that Hindus give is manifold, but one of the main reasons is, thank God that we don't have memories of what we did in our past lives, because it would be a tremendous psychological handicap in a way. It would be this tremendous burden on us, right? We've done things in this life that we're not proud of, let alone all what we did in our past lives. It would be too much for us. So it's God in our infinite wisdom has withheld from us memories of our past lives so that we can continue on our spiritual journey without being burdened by what we did in our past lives. Okay. Another objection, a very intuitive one. It's called the population explosion objection. This is the objection, well, look, even 100 years ago, the human population was much lower than it is now, right? It's almost exponentially increased since then. Where are all those souls coming from? Where's the soul supply here, right? And the standard Hindu answer is twofold. Number one, this earth is not the only realm in which there are souls. Souls reside in temporary heavens, temporary hells, and in eternal hells and in other realms as well. Okay, so these are called lokas. There are many lokas. Bhur, Bhuva, Sva, and so on. You know them. In Hinduism, there are many different lokas. Okay, which means what? Those souls can be coming from those other lokas and entering the earth when necessary. Another part of the answer is that souls inhabit not only human bodies, but also non-human animal bodies and plants. Right? This is very important, which means what? As the human population is increasing, it's entirely possible that there are souls of mosquitoes that are kind of being promoted to human lives. And in fact, I'm not just saying that as a speculation. Swami Vivekananda himself says that. Let me quote to you something he says. He says, Vivekananda says, "It is a significant fact that as the human population is increasing, the animal population is decreasing. The animal souls are all becoming men." It's a very interesting observation. I'm not sure how he did the empirical research on this, but it's certainly theoretically possible that that's the case, right? Okay, now I wanted to mention how much time? Okay, maybe I should just wrap up with the practical implications. I'm skipping chapter 5. So this again, you have to buy the book to read chapter 5. One thing I'll mention for anybody who's strapped for cash, some funding came through the John Templeton Foundation and other sources. And so they are going to make this book open access, which means that anyone can download a free soft copy, meaning a digital copy, an ebook version of this, a PDF, for free. It's not available for free yet, but it's going to be eventually. I was assured by Eugen Nagasawa, the general editor, that that's the case. It costs like $8,000 or $10,000. I don't know how much it costs to do that, but it wasn't my money. But they sponsored it, which means that if you want just a soft copy, you can get it. But if you want a hard copy, you can get it for about $20 through the publisher website or through Amazon. So I'm skipping chapter 5, and I want to just skip straight to practical implications for us as spiritual aspirants. And I want to mention just a couple of things. Some of you, especially Geeta here, whose name is appropriate because she's one of my regular students in my class, Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. And as she knows, and as some of you might know, I assign homework and I have study questions based on the homework. And I have Google Forms that I have the students fill out. And so one of the questions I asked in the context of chapter 2 of the Gita, apropos of that verse that I started this talk with, about how the soul casts off one worn out body and takes on a new one, like we cast off one set of clothes and put on a new set of clothes. I asked, how, if at all, do the doctrines of karma and rebirth play, how do they play into your day-to-day spiritual life, if at all? I mean, are they relevant to you? And I got this wonderful range of answers. There was one person who said, only one, who said, yeah, I'm open to the karma and rebirth, but they don't play any role in my day-to-day spiritual life. But the vast majority of people said that they do. And I want to share with you some of the answers that they gave me. And by the way, that one person who said that they don't play a role, and even if you don't believe in the doctrines of karma and rebirth, that doesn't make you, a bad person, or doesn't mean that you're not allowed to call yourself Hindu. No. Because even the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Mohendranath Gupta, M., he didn't believe in karma and rebirth at an early point when he first met Sri Ramakrishna. And he asked Sri Ramakrishna, well, is that going to harm my faith or my spiritual progress? And Sri Ramakrishna said, no, don't worry about it. But then ultimately, what Sri Ramakrishna said is, keep an open mind and don't say that my view alone is right. And then ultimately what happened? M started to believe in karma and rebirth, okay? But it's non-essential, but it still helps in our spiritual journey. I want to give some examples of how that's the case. For instance, what is one of the biggest fears throughout this world? Fear of death. Fear of our own death, fear of the death of our loved ones. Extremely common. No matter how long you've been coming to these talks, I bet some of you still have that fear. But if you really believed in karma and rebirth, you shouldn't have that fear. If you really believed that we are eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex, and that when the body dies, the soul persists, then why should you fear death? Either of yourself or of your loved one, actually. So one of the main things that these doctrines teach us at a very practical spiritual level is try more and more to identify with the soul, with the deeper soul within us, rather than with the body-mind complex. If we can really do that, it'll completely revolutionize our entire outlook on this world. The way we look at ourselves. We'll think about ourselves as souls using the body mind as instruments. We'll look at other people, not as physical bodies, not even as minds, but as souls on their own respective journeys.
Don't need to buy life insurance.
Yeah, right. No need to buy life insurance, exactly. And other examples. Parenting. I'll give you one of my favorite answers, and then we'll wrap it up. One student in my class, a very thoughtful student who's a parent, said this. He said, and I think I've read it before, but I'll read it again. I think I gave a talk here on karma and rebirth. He says, I think karma and rebirth have changed my views about raising children. The idea that I am nurturing a soul that has been here many times and is on its own specific journey helps me to view parenting with more of a stewardship and guidance lens and not a possessive mentality. I see no need to create a carbon copy, shape a child completely to my own ideals, or save them from eternal damnation. I understand that a soul may have chosen me to help them along in this part of their journey. It's a subtle but powerful shift. So I think that's a really thoughtful answer to this question of how karma and rebirth can, they're not just theoretical doctrines. That's what's important for us. If you really believe them, try to apply them in your day-to-day life. And this person explains really beautifully how it completely changed the way he looks at himself as a parent, actually. The kid has his own soul, and that soul is on its own unique journey. The parent's job is to be a steward, to help that soul along, not to create a carbon copy. Right, so that's the carbon copy version of parenting is Rajasic parenting, or what's called helicopter parenting, or snowplow parenting. There are lots of whatever, I don't know what the latest term is, right? But you don't let the child grow in his or her own way. You kind of try to mold your child in your own image. Karma and rebirth say, no, that child's soul is very unique. You need to understand the uniqueness of the unique soul profile of your child and let that child grow in his or her own way. Okay, so that's just another example of the practical implications. And then finally, another really important implication. Look, especially if you adopt this evolutionary approach to karma, which is that the overarching purpose of karma and rebirth is to foster our moral and spiritual evolution, our moral and spiritual growth. Then we can think of spiritual life as this long marathon, 26.2 miles. Each lifetime is a tiny increment in that 26.2 mile. It would be like 0.001 mile or something. And it means we're all running the same marathon. Some people are at the start line, other people are at mile 5, other people at mile 17, other people have reached the finish line. They're called Jivan Muktas, and then they finally leave the body, right? But we're all running the same marathon, and we should all help each other. There's no need to compete, because we're all going to reach the finish line in the end. One of the main implications of the evolutionary approach to karma is that every single one of us will eventually attain the highest goal of liberation. This is mentioned in chapter 6 of the Gita. Aneka janma samsiddhas tato yati parangatim, which means having attained perfection in the course of many lifetimes through these doctrines of karma and rebirth. What happens? We eventually attain perfection. Every single one of us will eventually will reach the finish line. We don't need to compete with each other. We should help each other along. Thank you. What do I do now? I always forget. Each center has different policies. Do I do the mantra or no?
No, it's Q&A.
Oh, okay, Q&A. Okay. All right. So Q&A, yes. Questions?
Wait for the microphone. And then,
We've got a question here up front, and yeah, we can start with her.
Hello, Swami. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
It was really interesting and profound for me.
And what, sorry?
Profound.
Yeah, thanks.
For me. I had a question about, well, let me first preface with, I like to go out birding, and I'm really interested in crows in particular. And the reason I mention this is that crows or corvids are birds that are very intelligent and have been studied by scientists and have been existed in a lot of religions and belief systems all over the world as being messengers between the spiritual world, like the heavens and like the material world. And I was wondering, how does karma play into that?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I don't have any strong thoughts about that, but one could easily bring in the law of karma, and they can say that the souls of at least some of these crows are evolved in a certain sense, such that they can play that role as the intermediary in a certain sense. You'll find that even among non-human animals, that there's actually a range of spiritual development in a certain sense. Ramana Maharshi had a pet cow, his favorite cow, Lakshmi. Some of you might be aware of Lakshmi. And apparently she was so evolved that he gave her, by his grace, she attained liberation as a cow, actually. So she didn't even need the human birth, the next birth, to get liberated. And so, and you know, everybody wants to say that their own pet is like already enlightened or whatever, but still, there are some who are, some pets who are more enlightened or closer to enlightenment than others. And so I think one can say the same thing about crows probably, and that one can also do a thing with species, that there are certain species that might be special. Now, do I have strong feelings about them? No, you might, because you're a birder and you've studied crows for a long time. But, you know, there's some people who are botanists who love plants, for instance, and they'll say the same thing about plants. They'll say that, look, even though we see plants as, you know, inert and, you know, something to be stepped on or to mowed, I see them as living beings. And they've done, you know, there are recent scientific studies about how plants communicate with each other, how trees communicate with each other, how they feel pain, how they suffer, how they respond to stimuli. If you play soothing classical music to a plant, it's going to grow better than if you play, I don't know, heavy metal or something like that. So they've done really interesting studies on this. But karma and rebirth, it just supports these theories because these plants have souls too. And then you might ask, this is something I talked about chapter 5. I had to skip it because I was running out of time. But you might ask, well, then even vegetarians have a problem because they're eating plants. And so plants have souls. And so how do we, what are we left with exactly? What do we eat? Air? Babhari Baba, we all become like Babhari Baba, eating air. Even the air has microbes, so then we're still killing creatures. So then we're in trouble. That's why Jainas, the really hardcore Jain monks, actually wear a mask in order to avoid inhaling even microbes that they might kill and then incur bad karma. They carry a broom with them to sweep aside critters as they walk on whatever road that they're walking on. It gets pretty intense. But fortunately, one of the main differences between Jainism and Hinduism is that Jainism doesn't believe in a god. It's an atheistic spiritual philosophy. And that's part of the reason why they have to resort to all this. Whereas we believe in God, thankfully. Okay, and because of God, what did Holy Mother Sharada Devi say about karma and rebirth? She said, if due to karma, the law of karma, you are due, what's due to you is a wound the size of a plowshare, which means a massive wound that might kill you. Something really bad. By God's grace, it can be reduced to a pinprick. That's the power of God's grace. And so, yeah, it's true that we're inhaling microscopic creatures on a daily basis and this and that. But by God's grace, if we embark on the right path and we engage in moral and spiritual activities, what happens? We'll still attain the highest goal in the end. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, so now then there's another part of this, and I talk about this in chapter 5 about vegetarianism. You'll find a lot of classical Hindu texts praising vegetarianism on the grounds of karma and rebirth, basically saying that you incur very negative karmic consequences if you eat meat. And Manusmriti, for instance, is one of these texts which has these really scary verses about how, you know, if you slaughter like a cow or something and you eat it, beef, you are going to be reborn as many times as there are hairs on the body of that cow. And then the cow is going to, the soul of the cow is going to end up eating you in the next, like really intense stuff to scare you off of eating meat. So it's really intense. But even then, so I do talk briefly about some of these classical Hindu arguments for vegetarianism. At the same time, an obvious question emerges, which is, well, okay, but then Hindus also say that plants have souls. So then how is vegetarianism any better? The argument is, and what's interesting is that way before Peter Singer, some of you, if you know anything about the contemporary debates about vegetarianism and philosophy, Peter Singer is one of the pioneers. He wrote a book called Animal Liberation, I think in the 60s or 70s. And now that's a hot subfield or cottage industry within philosophy. But some of these arguments were mentioned by Hindu philosophers, centuries before. One of them is this. Some of the commentators on Manusmriti, Kulluka Bhatta and Medhatiti, they both say, look, different species have different amounts of the three gunas, okay? And plants have more tamas than the non-human animals. And human animals, among all the animals, have the most sattva, which doesn't mean that all humans are perfectly sattvic, we know that. But the point is, compared to other species, humans are comparatively more sattvic, and the most tamasic species are plants, okay? Now, as a result, plants are less sensitive to pain and suffering than dogs and cats and human beings are. And therefore, because one of the main arguments for vegetarianism is that because animals feel suffering, we should avoid killing them and eating them. That's the idea. But we can eat plants. Why? Even though they have some degree of moral standing because they have souls, still they feel much less pain than cows and dogs and cats do and chicken do. And therefore, it's okay to eat plants, even though they have souls. Okay. All right. That's a long answer. And yes.
Swami,
Yeah.
I
No.
have a quick question on the beginnings of karma. I have a feeling in Hinduism there is no fall from Eden type concept. So where did karma, first karma?
Oh, yeah, this classic question. Yeah, that's also, I discussed in the book. But here's the thing. When you go really deep into the Hindu weeds, what you find is, what I found, is that there's one mainstream Hindu response, which is that karma is beginningless. That is the standard Hindu answer. It's anadi, which means there was no first birth. There was no point in time in the past when our karma originated. Okay? That's not the way it works. There's no fall in the Christian sense. Except for, as far as I can tell, one tradition within Hinduism. Can any of you guess what that one tradition is? Yeah, the ISKCON tradition. Have you already read my book, or you just? Oh, okay, well, that's why. She's cheating. Anyway, she's too good a student of mine. Okay, so ISKCON, yeah, the Hare Krishna tradition, founded by Prabhupada. It's a modern Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. And what he says is that there was a period in the past when we were all chilling in Goloka, which is this super blissful realm, absolute perfection. We're with Krishna and we're just hanging out. We're having a ball. And then for some reason, now this is where it gets tricky philosophically for Prabhupada and his followers. For some, Lord knows what reason, some souls decide to come to this earth and take up an earthly embodiment, knowing full well that it's nothing compared to the bliss of dwelling with Krishna in Goloka. And yet they do it anyway. And so actually one of the questions that I talk about in the book is, why in the world would any rational being, especially these are perfected souls. These are perfect souls who are living in bliss with Krishna. So that means they can't make an irrational decision. They won't make a bonehead decision, right? If that's the case, then why in the world will they come? And so there's a follower of ISKCON who's a good scholar who got his DPhil, PhD recently from Cambridge, named Akshay Gupta. I looked at his work, and his answer is curiosity. So curiosity is an interesting answer because it's not inherently bad to be curious, right? And so he's like, these people can't be bad, so you can't come up with any like sin. They couldn't have come down here out of sinfulness, but they just had a kind of an innocent curiosity to see what's going on in this earth. What are they doing down there? And then they end up having to be reborn again and again and undergo all sorts of torment and suffering as a result. So I point out that there's still kind of problems with the curiosity answer. But anyway, there is this one tradition within Hinduism, as far as I'm aware, and there might be others, but I'm aware of this one. The tradition of ISKCON, which says that karma does have a beginning. It's the moment when the soul left Goloka and entered this earthly realm that karma began. Because in Goloka, there's no karma and rebirth. There's just your soul dwelling blissfully with Krishna. But every other Hindu tradition says, as far as I'm aware, says, I have to be very careful when he says every tradition or every other Hindu tradition, because then you might find another one. So that's a challenge then for you guys. Is there any other tradition within Hinduism that posits a starting point to our karma? I'm not aware of any. Yes, Gita.
First, I just want to mention that I take it back.
Mm.
Thing.
Okay.
I'm a little bit confused
Okay.
about the soul needing to be mixed in with the Shukshma Shrira.
Okay.
Because my idea of soul includes all Shakti and Brahman, and therefore all consciousness and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Patanjali was leaving out, and that
Okay.
the only thing that's different between the soul
Mm-hmm.
and the one with the absolute is the subtle body.
Okay. So why do we need the subtle body at all? Why not just the Jivatma? Is that the question from a Vedantic standpoint? Right? Is it? Why do we need both together? Is that?
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
so-
if you have that belief that
What
the
belief? Oh, the Vijnana
that
kind of.
everything is God.
Yeah.
Everything is
Sure. Even then. Okay. So if we assume Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta view, which is that there's nothing but Divine Mother. Okay. Why do we need to posit a subtle body in association with the Jivatma as the entity that reincarnates? And so the answer is, I think, pretty simple actually, which is that it's the subtle body that is the repository of our latent mental impressions, of everything we've done in past births, the samskaras.
Well,
The
that's what
Jiva
I'm
doesn't
saying.
have them.
Only the subtle body is needed.
Oh, I see. You're arguing for the subtle body without.
Because
yeah.
everybody I mean, it's
Right.
automatic that everybody
Yeah,
has.
but the problem is the subtle body as such is not ensouled. It lacks a soul.
I disagree with that.
I think it might be a
There's
matter
nothing
of.
in this universe that is not
Oh,
Brahman.
well, hold on. But thank you. But there's a big difference there. So there's a difference between saying everything is divine consciousness and everything is conscious. Notice the difference here. I agree with you. Vijnana Vedanta holds that everything is divine consciousness. That doesn't mean that this iPad is conscious. It's divine consciousness, but it lacks sentience. It is not conscious. Why? Because it doesn't have a jivatma. It's not ensouled. Yeah, that's the difference.
Wait, just, I mean,
But can you give them, you just take the mic,
no, but
so,
I
well,
was
so that
just
people
gonna say
online can hear, yeah.
do we just, when you say like a rock, like that, do we say, I mean, it's just that the Atman is not being reflected as much, do we say it still doesn't have a soul?
There's no jivatma. I'm saying something very precise here.
Right.
There's no
So,
jivatma in
do we
the stone.
classify Jivatma, so the Jivatma you're saying basically is a subtle body, causal body, let's just say.
No, it's not. It's separate from the subtle body. It is a metaphysical, immaterial entity. It's the individual conscious self.
So we'll say yes, okay, so the rock will be conscious, you can see, you kind of, there's a.
It's not conscious. It is consciousness. But yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
but there's a pattern, there's a formation, you'll see that,
Huh.
they'll argue that way.
Who's the they?
Well, just what I've understood,
Okay.
consciousness
Uh-huh.
is, everything is, you're right.
Consciousness.
More-
Yeah,
correct,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, what I've understood though is that, is there a subtle body in this rock? I thought it's always that, it's just not reflecting the consciousness it's Thomas, so it's not reflecting the consciousness as a plant, or as a.
Right, yeah.
As
So,
something embodied.
right. So, but
well,
you're saying they say, but unless you tell me what tradition you're thinking of, it's going to be hard to.
This is just
Yeah.
something we
So,
can
so the point
pick
is,
up on
yeah.
the way here.
Right. But the thing is, there's no one answer. That's the whole point. Is that,
Right.
as far as I'm aware, the mainstream Hindu answer is rocks lack subtle bodies and they lack jivatmas. But from a Vijnana standpoint, they can still be divine consciousness because there's nothing but divine consciousness. But that doesn't mean that everything has a subtle body and that everything has a soul.
Right.
So the jivatma and the subtle body only inhabit human beings, non-human animal bodies, and plants is the mainstream Hindu view as far as I'm aware. And Kashmiri Shaivism, for some reason, leaves out plants. I don't know why. And I've gotten in debates with Nish about this because it doesn't sit well with him that plants don't have souls. But as far as I can tell, Abhinavagupta seems to claim that plants don't have souls.
So the argument
Yeah.
I've heard is like,
Yeah.
you'll see, like anything there's consciousness in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
you cut a rock, there's a formation, there's a pattern, there's a sort of so it is subtle body meaning what, but it's just not reflecting it.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I just don't think that's the mainstream Hindu view. And that's not, and what you just said has nothing to do with mind. Subtle body is mind, remember. Subtle body equals
Correct.
mind.
Again.
Now, you crack open a rock, what mind am I seeing there? I see a lot
I'm
of,
saying it, but again,
So,
it's
yeah.
Thomas.
Sorry?
It is Thomasic.
I know,
So
but,
again,
yeah.
it's just it doesn't have the reflective capacity
Yeah.
of reflecting the Atman.
Yeah.
sense
So you
that
just give me the text. I want to see the text which holds that because I'm doubtful, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Text. And a lot of people these days, they quote from YouTube videos, but I want to see give me the Hindu text. Yeah. but-
When you say Prabhupada
Yeah.
made this formation of like of his theory of
That there's a beginning to karma. Yeah.
so he must have he has to quote a text also. He cannot.
Yeah.
It can't just be an interpretation on his own.
Yeah.
It's got to be some textual.
Yeah, he'll try to read it in the Gita and he'll try to read it into Chaitanya Charitamrita, for instance, the Vaishnava text, the standard Vaishnava text. Yeah. Yeah. Although within the ISKCON tradition, actually, interestingly, there's heated debate about this, about what the actual view is, and some people actually part ways with Prabhupada. So there are multiple traditions of modern Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Edwin Bryan, for instance, belongs to a non-ISKCON form of modern Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and they have subtly differing views, actually, on some of these issues also. Yeah.
I think it's Swami, just reminding me a little bit.
Mm.
I think it's Vivekananda who said something about, I've got to find it,
Mm-hmm.
but about whether a rock still has consciousness. I just,
Just show me. Yeah, yeah. It's I just want to see the text, and then we can talk about it. Yeah. Geeta, anyone else before we? Yeah. First, let's give a new person a chance. Yeah. Namaste. The what piece? Motive. Yeah. Behind our action. Yeah. Mm.
So like, I find that sometimes I have to take kind of contrary action to do something that's really positive, and I know it's really good to do, but I don't necessarily want to do it.
Yeah. Correct.
And maybe I do it a few times, and then I actually feel like a sense of desire to do
Yeah.
that.
Sure.
Is that, I guess so just keeping that in mind, like, what happens if you do something that you really don't want to do, if you do it anyway, but it is positive? Like,
Yeah.
how do you have to wait until your motive is like sound before you take that action?
Oh, I see. No. Because otherwise you're not, you're never going to get started, right? So yeah. So I mean, there's a whole like little cottage industry within self-help sections of bookstores where they have books on habits, right? Forming good habits and the power of habits and countering bad habits with good habits, and that all falls under what I was calling the psychological explanation of karma, right? Which is that if my character now is more bad than good, what happens? And there's a choice between doing a good action and a bad action. My whole nature is going to push me toward doing the bad thing. So it's going to be really hard for me to do the good action, right? But if I do that, it means that's already unselfish because my ego desperately wants me to do the bad act, first of all, right? So the fact that my higher nature is prompting me to do the good action, even against my will, my animal nature, my lower nature, the rascal I, as Sri Ramakrishna calls it, means that I'm acting unselfishly. So the moment I do that, if I manage to do that, what happens? That creates samskaras. It carves out traces in the mind, which makes me more inclined to do good actions in the future. It doesn't happen overnight, but the more good actions I do, the more I develop good habits, which then form a part of my good character, and it leads to character reformation. Basically, that's how I see it. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, first, yeah, just hand it over to him and then we'll get, just because another new guy. Yeah.
Hi, Swami.
Hi.
I think it was your third or fourth question about what actually is reincarnated. And you said that from, a classical Advaitin perspective, one would say that these two ideas are at odds because, if you're purely, coming from a non-dual consciousness.
There's no rebirth and there's no jivatma. There's no individual souls.
The reason because there's nothing to be reincarnated if you're coming from that ultimate perspective.
I mean, there's nothing to be reincarnating. There's no arena in which in which reincarnation can take place. Literally nothing exists besides non-dual pure consciousness.
But practically, I guess, it helps to come from the other side.
Well, yeah, that's what a lot of so-called neo-Advaitins neglect, which is that so long as we have not realized the highest, let's not mix standpoints here. We are ignorant. We haven't realized Brahman. Therefore, we need to accept Jiva, Jagat, Ishvara. These are the three things that go together. They stand and fall together. From the empirical standpoint, I should accept the individual soul. I should accept this world of names and forms, and I should accept the personal God. I can only reject them once I've ascended to the standpoint of non-dual Brahman, the absolute standpoint. Until then, you got to accept the whole kit and caboodle. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and could you pass the mic down here? You can do a baton. Yeah.
About the Vijnani who has free will because they know that they are God, because everything is God. That seems like it would apply only to the Jnanis in that realm. Because like somebody like Sri Ramakrishna, he would always see himself as the child. And he would advise people become like the child or the servant or, have a separation and not actually be God. And therefore, if you are the child, you're not saying that I am God and I have all free will. So that aspect confuses me.
Right. Okay. So there are a few things here. We have to be careful of terminology because you said Jnani. Now, the thing is, the Jnani is not the one who realizes his identity with the impersonal, personal divine mother. Let's just call her divine mother. Because the Jnani is more about just the impersonal, non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness, right? So what you're thinking is, see, look at the way that Sri Ramakrishna talked about Chaitanya's realization, and even Sri Ramakrishna himself. It's true that in general, like by and large, he preferred to think of himself as child of divine mother. Sometimes though, he identified as Kali. He directly identified as an avatara, as God, and he bestowed grace in the form of God. And so I would say it's more accurate to say that he kind of toggled back and forth between different levels of consciousness, different planes of consciousness. One of which was radical identity with the impersonal, personal divine mother, right? Divine consciousness, when he knew that that he was free as mother. That's why when he left his body, what did Holy Mother say? She was crying and she said, "Oh, Kali, why have you left me?" Swami Vivekananda said it was Kali who worked up the body of Ramakrishna to achieve her own purposes, to work out her ends. So everybody saw, many people saw Sri Ramakrishna as Kali. Sri Ramakrishna, of course, saw himself as Kali. That's why he said he was doing puja one day and he saw himself as Kali and the cat as Kali. And so I would say actually that he had, so Vijnana is everything. I mean, it's not just that he was a Vijnani only when he realizes his identity with Divine Mother. He's also a Vijnani when he's a child of Mother, but knowing at the same time that the child is also a manifestation of Divine Mother, right? So it's still under the framework of the same Vijnana realization.
I guess I associate those kinds of thoughts with Kashmir Shaivism, and they have more of the
I think
I
that,
am
yeah,
Shiva sort of
right.
attitude.
So yeah, but I think that you'll find that in our tradition too. It's more subdued, I think, in our tradition. And you'll find, I think what you'll find is something more like Sri Ramakrishna will agree with Kashmiri Shaivites that this identification with Shiva or Divine Mother, absolute identity, is the highest goal and it's Vijnana, but that it may not be very practicable for most people. And so he's, more emphatic about thinking of yourself as a child, as a servant, just because it's less dangerous maybe from the standpoint of spiritual practice, I think, and more actionable and more practical. I mean, just as people can lose their heads by thinking they're Advaitins prematurely, I think the same thing can be said about Kashmiri Shaivites. The premature Kashmiri Shaivites who think, I am Shiva, and you become a megalomaniac, especially fueled by ChatGPT. There's this whole thing called ChatGPT induced or exacerbated psychosis, where if you tell ChatGPT, I think I'm Shiva, am I right? And then ChatGPT says, yeah, you're Shiva. And it'll keep feeding back to you what you want to hear, because it's this kind of echo chamber and it tends to flatter you. And it's literally, I saw this UCSF psychiatrist talking about how now there was a prevalence of cases of these two different kinds of AI-related psychosis. One is AI-induced psychosis, where the person didn't actually have mental health symptoms beforehand, but then ChatGPT actually induces them and turns them into spiritual megalomaniacs. This is a common thing now. And then there's another phenomenon which is called AI-exacerbated psychosis, where they already have underlying mental health issues. They already have psychotic symptoms, but in a milder form. And then this constant use of ChatGPT kind of exacerbates those symptoms and makes them go off the deep end in terms of psychosis. So we have to be careful about this stuff. Yeah. Okay, thank you, everyone.
So now Swami Mahayogananda will be coming next week. And then if you want to talk to Swami again, he'll be out in the garden. So if you have any more questions, you're welcome to have a Q&A with him.
And if any of you managed to get a copy of the book in that short period of time between my last talk here and now, I'd be happy to sign it. Okay, thank you, everyone. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.